So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome my good friend and colleague in the field, Devyani Sharma, who's going to talk to us about South Asian voices, stigma and prestige over 400 years. Now, I could talk for 400 years about her prestige, but she only has a very short time, so I'm not going to take up any more time, and I'm going to pass entirely over to you, Devyani. We're really looking forward to this.
Thanks so much, Karen. I wonder if it's possible to mute the, oh, it seems okay, but if it gets noisy, I think that the screen that says Michael Bonney has audio on from the room. So
yeah, so that's just us. So on our
yeah, it should be fine. But if it's noisy, it might we could mute. Yeah.
Yeah. No
okay.
worries.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's of course, when Karen got in touch with this theme for the summer school, I just like Karen, I could speak for 400 years about it, but I'm really happy to talk to you for 20 minutes. I'll try and keep to time about specifically South Asian, or I'm going to talk about in what's called Indian English, but South Asian subcontinent variety. And I'm going to look at this variety or cluster of varieties over a long period of time. And what I'd like to do, sorry, just making sure this is working, is talk about how attitudes to Indian English have or have not changed over this period of 400 years, and specifically what that tells us about wider systems of prestige. So as we all know, migration and transnational movement have become really a focus in sociolinguistic work because the world has changed in this direction. But when we look at Britain and South Asia, that contact has been in place for a very long time. So we're going to see some attitudes to originally colonial varieties of English over these 400 years, look at any change in status of Indian English in particular, but then close with a consideration of what any changes we see tell us about systems of prestige. And since it's 20 minutes, it's going to be a little bit telegraphic because I want to cover quite a few different points, but in the Q&A, we can come back to anything that might have been too quick or unclear. So I'm going to first talk about the colonial phase, the 18th and 19th century, when we see modernist language ideologies in place. And I'll say a little bit more about them in a moment. The second phase is 20th century London, so the earliest phase of post-colonial contact between Britain and South Asia. I'll talk about the same original colonial roles being in place, but then we'll spend more time talking about the third phase, which is the most recent, where we see more substantial change in attitudes and in use, and talk about what we could describe as postmodernist change or late modern change. What interests me about this final phase is, and this is in relation to the theme of the summer school, is that you could say there's some subversion of original hierarchies, some kind of decolonizing, but what I'll emphasize is the emergence of new hierarchies in that process. So just to clarify the terms I used, when we talk about modernity, we're often talking about 18th century to 20th century politics that developed particularly in Europe, politics based around nation states, industrialization, and for what we're talking about, particular normative cultures of how social class is determined, social structures, and a national level of work. So in terms of language and prestige, there is this very well-known association of a nation with a language during this phase, and also an importance of nativeness related to citizenship in those nations. But when we talk about late modernity and post-modernity, and I'm sure you're familiar with this shift, there have been very fundamental changes in terms of globalization, what's been described as polycentricity. For our purposes, a particular change in the nature of work and interaction being multinational for certain kinds of work. And for language and prestige, this has meant a number of changes, and there has already been quite a lot of discussion in sociolinguistics. So one of them is in the O'Rourke and Ramayo quote here, the increased prestige of new speakers in certain contexts, where we see nativeness no longer by definition outranking non-nativeness, and other types of cosmopolitan social class, for instance, becoming more important. So we'll come back to this distinction in the discussion. So let me start with the colonial hierarchy that first positioned Indian English relative to British English. I don't have time to go into the details on this slide, but the images are actually selected to show that social class was as important as race in the colonial period. We can talk about that. It's a point that I don't have time for in this talk. But what I wanted to show you here, and many of you will be familiar with it, is that around the middle of the 19th century, there was an institution of higher education in English in the Indian subcontinent that was part of the British Empire. And you can see on the left a description of English as preeminent even among the languages of the West, above Sanskrit and Arabic. And then you can see, sorry, I'm trying to look at my own slide here. On the right, very early, we start to see parodies of Indian English that was starting to develop in India through the local civil services, for example. So right away with the establishment of English in India, there were already developing varieties of Indian English, but these became established in 1835 and immediately lower status. And I'm skipping through the first two phases quite quickly. When we look at the 20th century and shift our focus to Asians in Britain, where we had a large migration into Britain, we see that even though we have a shift from the colonial to the post-colonial relationship, the status differential did not change that much. So here again, there's some details that I won't go into, but we have a presence of speakers of Asian varieties of English in the UK from quite early on. And then after independence of Asian, African, and Caribbean nations, from the post-war period onwards, we see active encouragement of that migration by Britain for labor purposes, and then later political hostility and restrictions. But this was the process of the introduction of speakers of Asian varieties into the UK. And as I said, when we look at the 20th century, we actually see that although these are no longer subjects of the British Empire, we still see a status differential. So Ben Rampton's work is one of the best to illustrate the status of Asian English, even relative to Creole stylization. And here you can see for his data from the 1980s, he describes Asian English as standing for deference, so lower status, dysfluency, stigmatization, and a wide gap between self and voice. So a kind of distancing when they were using Asian English. These kids, Asian or otherwise, were distancing themselves from that voice. It was a kind of mocking use. So I won't go into this example in detail, but this is just an example where Mohan, one of the kids, puts on a voice, an Asian style, but he's not using it to gain status himself. He's voicing a parent, an outsider, speaking to a younger child. So in my own data from West London, where I collected data from 75 individuals from different generations in the community, I also see evidence of that status differential. It's not surprising to find it among the first generation that were born and raised in West London, British Asian generations. So here we see an older man who said there were racial fights every day. This is talking about school. Even going through the corridors, you were in danger of attack. The teachers would lock their rooms just to carry on teaching. They didn't want to get involved. Featherstone School was by then about 40% Asian, so the older kids there would come to Dormer's Wells to escort us to be there at lunchtime and breaks. Outside the school, the violence would continue and people would come out of their houses to support white kids. So all of that older generation, these are British Asians who grew up in London, experienced this very explicit status differential mocking of speech. And they, in linguistic terms, which I'm not presenting here, they were able to switch completely to vernacular London English. It was a kind of survival speech style. What was interesting to us was that in the younger generation, so those who also grew up in West London, but much more recently, we saw very different experiences of growing up in the neighborhood. You can see from the percentages that by then they are in an ethnic majority in their neighborhood. And then we see younger people saying that it wasn't about racism, nothing like that. It was mainly Indians. British whites, there was only like one or two, this person says in his description of school. And what's very striking is that those younger men overwhelmingly had a fused kind of British Asian accent where they always had an element of the Asian voice. So they didn't erase it for what I would say is survival reasons that the older ones did. The older men in particular here did have an Asian style, completely Asian style. So they were bi-dialectal. The younger ones have this open British Asian kind of style that they don't feel a need to hide. So this contrast is what I'm going to develop further now. The older man that I quoted was raised in the 80s and represents that post-colonial phase 2, where we still see a status differential for speakers of Indian English and for that community. And then I'm going to compare it to the 21st century where we see some changes. Okay, so when we look at the current period, which I'm describing as 21st century, we could have two different predictions. So if the modernist values are still in place of nation and nativeness, then the long-standing stigmatization of Indian English that I've mentioned, both from the colonial period and the early post-colonial period, should remain in place. And there are discussions of how, in transnational contexts, we might have this prediction that, especially linguistically, the influence or relevance or usefulness of a stigmatized variety might be minimal and likely to dwindle in the course of time. I should clarify, Vertovec here is not talking about Indian English, just the transnational influence. So I hope that makes sense. So if the old modernist values where not being British or not being a native speaker are still in place, there isn't much use in maintaining Indian English. But the postmodernist predictions are less clear. In some way, we might expect there are changes, especially in terms of the valuing of the global over the local. So I'm going to, in the last couple of minutes, show you a very quick few examples in terms of speech production among young British Asians to show that we don't see the first prediction, we don't see a complete move away from Indian English and assimilation into more highly valued British English speech. We actually see, slightly surprisingly, a slight shift towards what's described as educated Indian English. So a higher status in terms of a hierarchy of Indian English varieties, variety of English from India. The second example that I'll end with is speech perception. And here it's not just British Asians. This was an experiment to see whether wider British perceptions have changed in a certain way and whether new stereotypes are developing for Indian English. So in terms of production, the shift that I mentioned that was slightly surprising is that I found that in the younger second generation British Asians, so that's if we're comparing older and younger, when I gave you those quotes earlier, they're all born and raised in Britain. They're all British Asians, didn't migrate during their lifetime to Britain. But the younger group has a maintenance of the set of features on the left, the yellow cream-colored box. And if you look at this list, which I don't have time to go through in detail, I can point you to where I've analyzed quantitatively their use of some of these. If we compare that list to the list on the right, which is in gray, which they don't maintain, we actually see that the ones on the left are associated with educated Indian English. The ones on the right tend to be associated with a more heavily L1 influenced second language use of English, so less high status among the different varieties of Indian English. This is quite striking. So here's a quick example of one where indefinite article allomorphy, so saying apple, declines across the community, but saying the apple, which is very common. I have it, you can hear it. It's a very common feature of educated Indian English. I'm using this phrase because it's used in the literature. You can see that that's not only maintained, but goes up in the younger group. The thing that's notable about this maintenance, you might say, well, that's because they've maintained a subset of their parents' features, but their parents have all of the features on the right side as well, because migrants are overwhelmingly not from those upper middle classes of urban India, which use educated Indian English. They are very much second language speakers of English. So their parents have a mix of all these features, and the subset that are retained are the ones associated with high status in India. To kind of corroborate that, we see here qualitative evidence of this slight shift in attitude. I showed you from Ben Rampton's work the kind of status that Indian English or Asian styled English has had in the UK. There's a lot of evidence of that. But here you see a young British Asian man talking to me, where I didn't really go into this particular, I wasn't expecting him to talk about this. I just asked how he would describe his accent. And he said, I'm trying to get a slight Indian tone to my accent. I think I've got quite a posh accent maybe, and he did. So he had a very standard British accent, and he's trying to add an Indian tone to his voice. And then when he talks about why, he says it's recent, I want to learn Hindi that might increase my voice in an Indian way. So it's really to have that Indian sound and marry somebody from India. So this is a kind of stance that is, to me, was quite distinctive, to actually want to displace a posh British accent with more of an Indian sound, so Indian from India. I haven't got time to show the wider patterns of this, but there's a kind of, the production data I showed you earlier supports this, that we actually see younger people doing a bit of this. It doesn't mean they're just speaking in Indian English, but there's this both in the meta-linguistic commentary and in production, we see this at least shift in the direction that modernist values would not predict. So this really contrasts in many ways from Rampton's very clear and convincing analysis of Asian accents as very rarely aligned. Here we see very clear alignment with that voice and wanting it. So why now in terms of speech production? There's quite a clear case that you could make for a change in stereotypes of Asians. So there's a very conspicuous presence of flashy upper class Asians in the UK. In my interviews, one of the young men said "Gore," which means white people like India now. And there are these, new associations of IT, industry, banking, and so on, where it was very strongly, and in interviews, everybody reported on this. It used to be drought and poverty, and now there's this very different stereotype. So for speech production, we can see this as a kind of reaching for a new form of social mobility, recognizing that there are these high status English users in the Indian subcontinent. There's some Hoffman et al. And Ben Aish et al. Have talked about this epicenter effect of Indian English, and that British Asians might be picking up on that rather than fighting it out within the British class system. They have access to this other kind of new status. So in production, we see this kind of postmodern transnational alignment unexpectedly, given older modernist predictions. But what about speech perception? And I'll just end in 2 minutes with a description of speech perception. So what I wondered is if there is this kind of changed status of Indian English, some kind of improved status and association with technology, IT, or other kinds of novel global associations, would it be observable in general British listener reactions? So the experiment that I'll show you didn't just test what people think of Indian English or British English by playing clips of different varieties. A lot of recent work has said that really attitudes to accent are influenced by context, particularly alignments of accent and persona. So we expect certain people to have a certain way of speaking. And I was inspired specifically by a journalist, David Goodhart, who has written about Brexit in the UK, not about language, where he uses this terminology you might be familiar with, anywheres and somewheres. And he talks about Brexit as the demotion of somewheres, a kind of revenge of the somewheres. So anywheres have what he calls mobile, portable, achieved identities based on education, career success. And somewheres are rooted in the UK, in the context he's talking about, not as highly educated, linked to place and community. So I was interested to know whether there's a global tech expert stereotype where strong L2 accents are actually associated with being a tech expert. In fact, the more obscure the accent, the more you might have had this global life path of an elite education and being a kind of genius from somewhere. I shouldn't use somewhere, from anywhere. So being very non-local, but being this kind of IT or science whiz. So the prediction would be improved status of Indian English in those stereotypes, but not in others. So the experiment, I'll just say very briefly, I don't want to go over, looked at Indian English, RP, Standard British English, and a strong regional accent in British English. And the prediction for tech evaluations is that the new stereotype might actually even exceed a Leeds accent, which might be to somewhere. So the design of this is really to test whether even a native speaker of British English might fall behind this globalized stereotype of a tech, IT tech guy. But we wouldn't predict it for non-tech contexts. So the design is that listeners heard a clip from a lecture that was either about technical computer science expertise or personal advice dealing with stress and so on. And they had to just rate confidence in the speaker, expertise, and so on. And what I found was that the Indian English voice in the tech context, those three were just all together to look at tech, showed the sharper slope of change, so the only significant age effect. So here you can see that where older listeners on the left rate Indian English quite low, even if they're talking about IT stuff, but it goes up for younger speakers. But you can see that Leeds remains flat. And if you look at the left side, you can see that the slope of the Indian English tech guy stereotype is potentially starting to outrank Leeds. And RP doesn't have a significant effect, and it's higher. But interestingly, as predicted, in a non-technical guise where you're giving advice about personal problems, stress, Indian English is lowest. The age change is not significant. Leeds is second and RP is top. So we see here that yes, there seems to be a substantive change in wider perceptions of Indian English, but related to particular stereotypes. So I'll just end with a summary. So what has actually changed? We find, yes, by the third phase, there's some reduction in stigma, both in production among British Asians and perception UK-wide. We see a demotion of the classic prestige of citizenship, nation state, and nativeness, but a rise of a new form of social capital that's globalized stereotypes and personae. So we don't see a loss of prestige and hierarchy per se, but a change in what is valued for prestige. So we see a reorganization rather than dismantling of elites. In production, we saw a reaching out to Indian English. Yes, that looks like subversion, but it's of, using a one subordinate variety, but only the elite sub-variety from India. And then in perception, yes, valorizing non-native speakers of a certain kind, cosmopolitanism, but only in a particular stereotype and at the cost of the too local regional British speaker. So I would describe this as, yes, a kind of decolonization, but a re-hierarchization and new inequalities based on a kind of global social class system. Thank you.
So as you know, Devyani, Robert is hot on your heels. So we
Yes.
really have time for one, maybe two, if they're very quick questions. But I know, Devyani, you'll be very open to people writing to you by email direct and
Definitely.
following up that way. So please, first hand.
Got a quick one. Sorry.
Mario has a quick one.
Hello, Devyani. Very, very interesting presentation. Thank you very much. This is just a curiosity question, but in your experience and in your research, what do you think the role of the call center as a space may have had in what you told us? You know, in how these attitudes, etc., have shifted over time towards Indian English within a British context. What do you think of that?
I think it has a big role. I think that a number of these kind of work contexts have been a big part of the change. It's a bit different for British Asians. There are a lot of other inputs. So in West London, they actually encounter these wealthy Asians. So there's more going into that group. But I think for the British public, that's one of the main routes for changing, for a new stereotype. Also, not just call centers, but you know how there's a lot of outsourcing of publication work, for example, you know, so we always deal with Indian publishing editors and typesetters. So I think there's a lot of work that's transnational, even in legal firms, a lot of outsourced work in call centers plus. So I think it is a very big part. Claire Cowie and others have shown that, you know, this huge industry has this effect.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Devyani. And I'm just delighted with what we've heard. It's been fantastic. I've really enjoyed it. I need to get on to you about my somewheres and anywheres for my Irish English research.
Yeah.
We'll do that by email. And I noticed something came up in the chat about people wanting access to your email address. And again, I am sure you're happy for people to take questions
Please
that way. Thank you so much. And listen, enjoy time with your family, because I know that's what you're doing at the moment.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Take care, Devyani. Bye.